Well, how do we police this term biological? Are we doing inspections? Are we asking people to lift their skirts up and drop their knickers and say, what have you got between your legs? Are we going to judge people? Can take blood tests?
Well, she said, hang on a minute, she said
what biological means.
She's saying that biological means your biological sex at birth.
When rights collide in a private space, whose boundary actually takes priority? Kemi Badenoch's proposal was presented as a straightforward attempt to define sex in the Equality Act as biological sex. But listen carefully to this exchange, because the debate quickly moves beyond political slogans and into something much harder to dismiss: women's changing rooms, toilets, refuges, prisons, and other single-sex spaces. Joan Lockwood argues that such a rule would unfairly exclude trans people and could become practically impossible to police. But the interviewer keeps returning to the pressure point. If the purpose of a female-only space is to exclude biological males, does gender identity override that boundary? Or does biological sex remain decisive? And that distinction matters, because once politicians refuse to define where the line is, institutions are left trying to interpret it themselves, while ordinary people are expected to live with the consequences. Watch this exchange closely. The real argument isn't simply about toilets. It's about whether government is willing to draw a clear boundary when competing rights. Cannot both prevail at the same time. Before we roll the clip, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Debate Central, and turn on notifications. Now let's get into it.
Vote 2024 with me, Camilla Tominey. Lovely to have your company this evening. Now, the Tories today have proposed a trans ban in single-sex spaces. This is what Kemi Badenoch, the Women and Equalities Minister, told GB News about the policy earlier.
The problem we're solving is, for many organizations like rape crisis centers, prisons, for instance, where people may identify as a woman even though they're biologically male, and they don't know what to do. And we are clarifying what public authorities need to do, what perhaps individual private institutions' rights are. A lot of them are worried about being sued even when they're doing the right thing. So this is a tidy up of law so that we can create a better space for this conversation.
And here's what the Liberal Democrats' Daisy Cooper had to say.
I do think it is a cynical move in a general election campaign to try and wage another phony culture war. But on the very specific policy, what I would say is that Liberal Democrats have always said that if there is any confusion amongst service providers, then more guidance can be provided.
Joan Lockwood, the founder of See Change Happen, a firm that gives diversity and inclusion advice to businesses, joins me now. Joan, what's your reaction to this Tory proposal to change the Equality Act so that that word sex is replaced by the term biological sex to make it clearer?
It's the act of a dying government who have absolutely no hope of getting back in again. They're throwing meat to their grey voters, hoping that it's going to inspire some votes their way. It's going to be unimplementable, whatever they're proposing. I listen to Kemi all day on various chat shows and various interviews, and the objective really is conflating transgender, transsexual people with predatory men. I am not a man. I'm not a predatory man. And she is looking to exclude me and others like me from spaces that we can legitimately occupy using bias and discrimination.
But isn't she concerned that that word sex, just on its own, without biological ahead of it, can be willfully misinterpreted, and that actually women deserve women-only spaces, that that's acceptable? Although you may not agree with this analysis, with the gender-critical view that trans women aren't actually women, they're trans women, so too are women allowed to be protected in their own spaces. So in refuges, in toilets, and anywhere else where we would expect a male-free environment, even if it's males who have undergone some degree of taking puberty blockers or other gender realignment. Effectively, women's only spaces should be for biological women only.
Well, how do we police this term biological? Are we doing inspections? Are we asking people to lift their skirts up and drop their knickers and say, what have you got between your legs? Are we going to judge people? Can take blood tests?
Well, she said, hang on a minute, she said
what biological means.
She's saying that biological means your biological sex at birth. Surely that's the fairest way to assess it, because members of the transgender community themselves say that they don't want a differentiation between those who have undergone surgery and those who haven't. They're saying if people identify as a woman, they should be regarded as a woman. What she's saying is, no, we have to go back to the fact of the matter. And when it comes to women's only spaces, the only assessment we can ever really make, and the only assessment we can ever use to be fair, is to go back to the beginning, look at a birth certificate and say, in what sex was this person born?
Okay, so you're out in public, you're going to a pub, and you want to use the toilet, and there's someone there saying, I'm not sure this person passes my test as being a woman. How do you yourself prove you're a woman and able to access these spaces? This is where this term biological sex becomes ludicrous. How do you and other biological women prove that they are biological women? Have you ever taken a chromosome test? Have you ever proved the fact you're a woman? I have a birth certificate. I have a passport. I have a driving license. I've had various operations and surgery. I can prove that I'm a woman. Can you prove you're a woman?
But I don't need to prove I'm a woman because I'm not making... No, but women who haven't undergone any kind of gender realignment, or indeed that aren't presenting as transgender women, don't need to prove anything because they're not claiming that they want to use other people's spaces. But then how big is this toilet issue to you, Joanne? But Joanne, how big is the toilet issue to you? If there's a disabled toilet... issue. What's this need? But what's this need, this kind of, if it's not, because this is the confusion as well. There are some transgender people who said it's not about toilets. Well, why then do you care which toilet you use?
Well, why do you care who's in your toilet then? What's the big deal about toilets? I mean, I spend my life talking about toilets. Why can't we bring the conversation into a different
I can't tell you why. I tell you why we worry about toilets. We worry about toilets because we worry about our daughters. Because as Kemi Badenoch herself has said, there's been a number of cases in different schools where boys who are identifying as girls have been allowed into the toilets. Toilets are seen by young girls, particularly when they've just started their periods and maybe they're wanting to discuss things with their own girlfriends. That's seen as a kind of, it's a place of sort of solace, privacy and sanctity. Badenoch has made the point that in some schools, because of this idea of letting boys who identify as girls into girls' toilets, it's put girls off from using the toilets, and some girls have ended up with urinary tract infections. That's why it's important.
Oh, I'm not saying that it's not important to some people, and I fully accept that we need to ensure that predatory men, people with nefarious motives, are kept out of spaces that are designed to be safe. I completely support that, but I am not. Okay. And people I know are not threats to women, threats to girls. We are not predatory. What Kemi is trying to do is use the trans argument against trans women. What about trans men? If you think about a trans masculine person who's on testosterone, their voice has deepened, they've grown a beard, they've probably lost some hair, they may be bulked up in muscle, and they're forced to use the female toilets. How are you going to feel if a trans man is in the toilet and you won't be able to distinguish whether that man is biologically male or biologically female?
But she's asking for clarity, isn't she? But she's saying if you go back to original birth certificates... No, but Joanne, sorry. If you go back to original birth certificates, you couldn't be clearer. The argument is...
And this is exactly why the debate over single-sex spaces keeps coming back. Not because people are obsessed with toilets, as critics sometimes suggest, but because toilets, changing rooms, refuges, prisons, and other intimate spaces force the legal theory into the real world. That is where abstract language about identity has to meet privacy, safeguarding and competing rights. Joan Lockwood's position is that trans people should not be treated as inherently dangerous, and that a law based strictly on biological sex could create practical problems. She raises the obvious enforcement question. If access depends on biological sex, how exactly is that supposed to be checked? Are people expected to carry documents? What happens to women who do not fit conventional expectations of femininity? What happens when a trans man enters a female space because the law requires access according to birth sex? Those are legitimate implementation questions, but they do not answer the central issue the interviewer keeps putting forward. If a space is specifically designated for women on the basis of sex, and biological males can access that space simply by identifying as women, then what exactly does single sex still mean? That is the contradiction Kemi Badenoch's proposal was trying to resolve. The policy argument here is not that every transgender person is dangerous. The transcript itself makes that distinction repeatedly. Joan says she is not a threat to women and girls. and the interviewer does not argue that every trans person is. The question is whether rules should be written around individual intentions or around clear categories that institutions can consistently apply. That matters because safeguarding rules are usually built around categories precisely, so they do not depend on trying to read somebody's motives. You do not normally wait until harm occurs before deciding where a boundary should exist. And this is where the politics becomes very uncomfortable for parties that prefer to describe the entire issue as a manufactured culture war. Daisy Cooper's response was essentially that more guidance could solve confusion. But Badenoch's argument, as presented in the clip, was that the confusion exists because organizations are worried about what the law actually permits. If service providers are uncertain whether they can lawfully maintain female-only spaces, then telling them to wait for more guidance does not resolve the underlying definition. Eventually, someone has to decide what sex means. That is the legal pressure point. Joan's strongest counter-argument is enforcement. If the law says biological sex determines access, institutions still have to work out how that standard functions without humiliating people or encouraging amateur policing based on appearance. That is a real challenge, and any serious policy has to address it. But the existence of an enforcement challenge does not automatically invalidate the principle itself. We have difficult rules in many areas of public life. The question is whether the underlying boundary is justified and whether it can be administered fairly. And for a lot of women, the answer starts with a very simple expectation. If a space is described as female only, they expect biological males to be excluded. That does not mean transgender people should be denied dignity, safety, employment, housing, or access to appropriate facilities. It means different groups may sometimes require different accommodations because their interests are not identical in every context. That is something modern politics often struggles to admit. Inclusion sounds simple until two rights pull in opposite directions. At that point, slogans like trans women are women or just follow the birth certificate are not enough on their own. Government has to explain the rule, justify it, and make clear who is protected when those claims conflict. And this clip shows why public trust suffers when politicians avoid that work. If voters believe the law is deliberately vague, institutions feel exposed, women feel ignored, trans people feel targeted, and everyone ends up more suspicious of everyone else. That is not good policy. It is the consequence of refusing to define the boundary clearly. So the real question after this debate is not whether one side cares about safety and the other does not. It is whether sex-based protections can continue to mean anything if biological sex is no longer the controlling category in the spaces where those protections matter most. Joan Lockwood says the proposed change risks discrimination and practical absurdity. Badenoch's side says clarity is necessary because institutions need to know what they are legally allowed to protect. That is the real divide. And if government wants the public to trust the answer, it has to do more than call the argument a culture war. It has to explain where the line is, why the line is there, and what happens when somebody crosses it.